today I'll be presenting on a topic that is very personal to me and that I am very passionate about and that I want to understand further. So at the beginning of the semester, I was struggling with a few issues that might have been related to some trauma I went through, but they didn't match, any of the symptoms that are usually on websites, and I'm like, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And after a very tough year, very tough 2 years of college, and a diagnosis of ADHD, I was like, wow, really? Really, is that what it is? So that started my journey with being interested in sex differences, just in different mental health diseases and how they present and how that affects diagnosis. The study I'm going to present today studies sex differences and their effects on maltreatment in the brain and how they present in behavior and also neurobiologically. So we will see how the brains of girls and boys that have been abused look very different. So, back to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACEs study. So, this study was huge. About 17,000 people took the survey where they wrote down if they had experienced any traumatic events. And adverse experiences is described in the study as having a parent that has a mental illness, a parent that has been to jail, not having enough to eat, being sexually or physically or emotionally abused or neglected. And what's super striking is that only 36% of that huge group of people who were 70% white and 70% educated, only 36% said they didn't have any of these events in their life that were correlated to higher rates of obesity. Here we have a brain of a 3-year-old child. This brain, it looks very different, so neurologically things are changing. We have the pyramid here that relates that shows us like the pathway to early death from adverse childhood experiences. So it just affects it affects the body and all of the systems that are important for maintaining health and living a healthy life. So in our book that we started class off with, we got a lot of information about how this happens from cell to cell, and how stress can damage the developing brains of children especially, but also of adults. So I paused when I read this part of the book, that men and women handle stress differently. I'm like, all right. So I clearly remember that part of the book. And the two different hypotheses that, one that says that women may use something different than fight or flight to deal with stress, because evolutionarily it would make sense for them to have a different kind of strategy that would enhance their reproductive success. By running away, their kids who depend on them probably have more than one because humans have short IVIs. So with our Paleolithic bodies and our hunter-gatherer ancestors, that would not have been a very adaptive strategy to have women and men who both have different roles in society deal with stress the same way. All right. So now to start with my study that assesses the neurocorrelates of cognitive and affective processing in maltreated youth with post-traumatic stress symptoms. Does gender matter? So I sent out a study at the beginning. The study was a little different, but I'll relate it at the end as to what this all means in in combination with this study. So the purpose of the study was to investigate the interaction of maltreatment and gender on the brain and these two specific neural networks, affective processing and executive functioning. And we already have learned some parts of the brain that are more responsible, more activated to get you to do something and plan, versus feel sad when you hear a song, right? So here I noted a few things that each system is responsible for. Executive network, regulation of emotion, attention, and behavior. So that's like when you have to do homework and you're like, but I want to go do this, but I don't need to do this. That's the part of your brain that's like, no, you have to focus, you have to do this. It also regulates emotion and attention. So that's the prefrontal cortex. We'll simplify it at that. But there are tons of different complicated pathways that are conflicting in the research, honestly. So we'll stick to that one. And that's what the study uses to assess executive functioning. And then the amygdala and the hippocampus for effective networks. So that's like vigilance, emotional processing, emotional information, and the stress and fear response. So the hypothesis of the study is very thick. It's like this. And most of it is background information because, as we've seen in class, there's a lot out there correlating child abuse and complex trauma to negative outcomes. So here we have the hypothesis. So based on all the information and all the patterns they found in the studies, the researchers hypothesized that the maltreated group, both male and female, compared to the non-maltreated group, both male and female, would look different under the fMRI. It's called the oddball task. So I'll tell you more about that later. But that they would perform differently, that their brains would look differently, and consume oxygen at different parts differently. And that the maltreated group would have increased affective processing activity in the brain, so more activity in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, and decreased executive functioning activity. And I'll let you know how the study measured these in the next few slides. And then, we already know this, kind of. We know this. And so this is the important hypothesis here. They hypothesized that maltreated males versus maltreated females would have more dysregulation due to the traumatic events in both affective and executive networks. So we'll see if the hypothesis holds up. So study design was an fMRI study, and we have these two groups, the non-maltreated group, non-maltreated control group. We have 45 of them, 26 females, 19 males, maltreated youth with PTSD symptoms, and the way, you see we have a lot more of the non-maltreated controls because it was very difficult to find children who had been maltreated, who were also healthy, right? Because then they would have to control for other like physical and emotional issues, which we'll talk about later. That's a limitation of the study. But the way they recruited these maltreated youth, right? Because it's I was wondering, like, how do you recruit all these people? But, oh, if you're abused, come. And these kids are young. They range in the age of from 5 to 16. So, like, their parents aren't going to bring them. Like, so what, the way they went about it was they presented at child services programs and buildings. And I think they didn't specify, but I'm guessing they had a monetary pay or some kind of benefit for these people. and they just kind of like recruited people from there. And yes, and then the non-maltreated controls, the way they recruited those were at schools or community centers. So the emotional oddball task. So this got really tricky, and it took me a long time, it took Judith and I a long time to understand it. But they did a version of a test that has been done quite a few times in studies of trauma and assessing affective versus executive dysregulation. So the whole task is important because it allows the researchers to analyze just the affective functioning without the executive, and the executive without the affective, and then both together in each group. So then they can make these relationships and come up with conclusions that may relate some of these symptoms to diagnoses with other disorders. So for demographics, they tried to control for as much as they could with race and age and a few other things, but something they pointed out at the end that you can see here is that for the maltreated group, they have lower SES, and it was so hard for them to like balance that out, but they take care of that statistically later. So yes, they try to balance all of these demographic and racial conditions. So they went through a very long process to examine each child and to look through their record. And a challenge they had was assessing the degree of maltreatment and the age that it started. That was something that they could not control, but just from speaking to the kids and speaking to their current caretakers, as well as teachers. So they went out of their way. They went out to ask other people about how this kid was, how this kid has changed, and about behaviors. They didn't just take the child's word or the mom's word. So I thought that was a strength of the study. They used something called the Kitty Schedule for affective disorders. They mentioned it over and over. They used it to diagnose and to put people kind of on a scale. And then archival records, they looked at report cards, they looked at their immunizations, notes from their doctors. So the emotional oddball task, they did a block design with different stimuli presentations. So there are a lot of faces, as you saw here. There are different kinds of faces. So you have a face with fear, and then you have a calm target. But they explained in the study that many studies have shown that a calm face affects children. It's the still face. It's the still face. So they just wanted to see if there was a difference between the two. So they're both meant to be emotional stimuli. So the way that the entire task, oddball task works is that they have, what did we say here? So they have 5 runs, and within each run they have 12 segments, and then 12 other runs, 12, I meant segments. But within those, they do 3 rounds, 3 or 4 rounds, depending on which group it is. So to simplify it, basically what they do is the baseline for the test is that they just present random faces, like at random. Some are sad, some are not, some are smiling. They try to control for having people of different races in these faces that they present while the person is in fMRI machine. And then one block, 12 which in each run, has a running rabbit. And the running rabbit everything will stop, the faces will stop, and then the rabbit will run through the screen. And then maybe while the rabbit is running through the screen, a face will light up. But they have 4 of these rounds.